I just want to start off by saying thank you all for joining us. Thank you for making the time today. And a huge thank you to UCLA's Green Initiative Fund for providing the funding for this event. It allowed us to pay our intern, Kyle Alice, for his time on this project, which is huge. So thank you again to UCLA. I want to start today's conversation by talking about how climate change is by nature a social, economic, and racial justice issue. The research is clear that people of color, and specifically Black communities, are disproportionately affected by ecologically harmful infrastructure and climate change. The research and the mission of LARC has kept these issues at the center, though I don't think we've gone far enough. We've been successful at creating a coalition. We have not been successful at creating a coalition that reflects the region. We are using the current demonstrations as both a call for action and a call to look within. We welcome and encourage you all to be a part of this process. If you're doing this work, please reach out to me. I could use allies as I think through what LARC needs to do better. As a first step, I have an invitation from LARC's sister climate collaborative in the Bay Area, BayCan, to join their training this Thursday. So I'm going to put that up on the screen. It is this Thursday. It's on operationalizing equity and in adaptation planning. So if you'd like to attend, there's two ways. You can either email me now. We can drop my email address into the chat and I'll send you the information. Or on our survey at the end of the event, we will ask you if you'd like to attend this training. And anybody who says yes, we will send out the information for that training. And before we get into today's event, I just want to frame it by saying LARC's meetings and forums are always a safe place to learn from peers about what does and what does not work. We hope to create a space today for you to learn from your peers' experiences, their successes, and their challenges. The panelists today will share what they're working on, answer your questions, and also welcome your feedback. So with that, I will introduce today's panelists. Each one of them will pass it on to each other without me interrupting in between, so I'm going to introduce all three right now. Kristen Baja is the Climate Resilience Officer for the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. Baja develops strategies to advance climate resilience planning and implementation. While planning this event, I heard from one of the attendees telling me, confirming that she's definitely an expert in this area. And I'm thrilled that she's made the time to share her knowledge with us today. Natalie Hernandez is with Climate Resolve. She is also currently serving on LARC's Leadership Council, so I've had the pleasure of getting to know her over the last few months. Her counsel has been invaluable to me and to the organization. Today, she'll be covering a few recent and current Resilience Hub initiatives that are taking place in Los Angeles. And finally, we have Eric Fournier, who is with UCLA's Center for Sustainable Communities. Eric is a data and mapping whiz. He has been incredibly generous with his time whenever I've had a geospatial quandary to throw his way. Thrilled to hear about his new project that is a prototype tool for helping to identify locations.
So hopefully we can make this work. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Baja. I am the Program Director for Climate Resilience with the Urban Sustainability Directors Network. For those of you who have maybe not heard of USDN before, we are a network of over 240 local governments in North America. I'm really privileged to actually have the opportunity to work with these amazing leaders. Most of these folks are in areas of sustainability, climate change, and racial equity. And we really focus in USDN on centering all of our work in racial equity first and foremost. And so it's actually a requirement for our members to go through a variety of training then before joining the network, and just grounding everything in our racial equity work. Part of that is for me to acknowledge to you as we're here that I am a white woman of privilege about to talk to you about a lot of concepts around racial equity and shifting of power. And so to acknowledge that first and foremost and acknowledge my own privilege in this space. So Moving on, USDN has a different sort of definition of resilience, and I think it really ties into the Resilience Hub's concept. So I wanted to put it on the screen for you, not to read it to you, but instead to say we are wholeheartedly against the NOAA definition of bouncing back. We see resilience as something where our communities are able to anticipate and accommodate, but actually thrive amidst our changing climate conditions. And we focus a lot on enhancing quality of life. And when I'm talking quality of life, I mean year round. This is not just something where we are focused on a disruption. And in that, we moved from thinking of resilience as just one sort of piece into resilience in 3 modes. Acknowledging that we have an everyday need for resilience because a lot of our communities are still not having their needs met. So we have a lot of needs around infrastructure and services, noting that there are no major disruptions, but there's still a lot of programming and other opportunities to focus on community needs. Additionally, there then is disruption. And a lot of times when people are thinking of disruption, they're thinking of big, huge events, hurricanes, earthquakes. I think that we have been hit in this current disruption with a long-term disruption related to the pandemic, and also going into sort of multi-crisis or multi-disruption modes. So really to note that when we're talking about resilience hubs, we're talking about all disruptions, both those short-term ones or shock events that hit relatively quickly, but then also these everyday ones that really impact us at a global scale, such as a war or a pandemic. And then noting that there's this recovery phase and the process of either returning to or moving from normal and defining a new normal or everyday mode. And that's the aftermath of the disruption and really thinking about getting to better conditions. So this is just something to ground you in this space because it's really important as we move forward in talking about resilience hubs. And what we're looking at is a real reframing. So instead of centering on the disruption or the disaster, we're really centering on people and human needs and human everyday needs first and foremost. As I mentioned, we have all of those 3 modes. If we're not focusing on the fact that we're not meeting human everyday needs right now in a non-disruption mode, or I would say pre-pandemic and a non-pandemic mode, it's not working. Centering around the disaster is just putting us into a response and recovery sort of circle, instead of focusing on how are we being proactive, how are we being prepared, and how are we building up the community's adaptive capacity first and foremost. In that, I want to acknowledge that folks on this call, a lot of you and the folks that I work with, we work with government and a lot of you work with institutions, and those are both very broken systems. They're based on faulty beliefs. Our US Constitution is based on the faulty belief that white male landowners are the only citizens worth talking about and caring about. And so in that, we need to be aware that we've stolen land, that we've intentionally put people of color and different tribes into harm's way over decades, and also that we've treated people as property and free labor. Women are always considered second-class citizens and treated as property, and then we've also seen US land as something that's just infinite and natural resources as being infinite. So part of this work is acknowledging the broken systems and moving into a more corrective action space. So racial equity work is correction, and that's our individual work and our organizational work. And part of what we need to be doing with all of our work is correcting these disparities, thinking about natural resources as limited, thinking about the fact that we have untapped human potential, and then also really adopting this targeted universalism approach, which I will get to in a second. But I think the biggest piece to note in this is that we're really rejecting the cookie cutter, which means, unfortunately, for a lot of the federal government programs, that's the way things are done, where it's a very cookie cutter approach, treating everybody the same, especially in the response and recovery space. That's centering on the disaster, that treating everybody, that we put into shelters and not considering different culturally significant elements. So resilience hubs are centered on rejecting the cookie cutter. USDN's entire resilience program is on rejecting the cookie cutter. And it's more focused on what we call a targeted universalism approach, which has come from the Haas Institute in Berkeley. If you have not heard of it before, I would say look it up, because I don't have a lot of time to give you the info right now. But the idea is that we need to be inclusive of all folks, right? The dominant and the marginalized groups, but we actually need to be focusing more on this corrective action and thinking about the way that we prioritize our marginalized groups first and foremost in our budgeting, in the way that we do outreach, the way that we consider engagement, and the way that we have our projects structured. So this is something we can go into a lot more depth, but I just want to mention this approach is what we use for resilience hubs. So what is a resilience hub? A resilience hub does actually have a building. So I want to note that it does have a structure, and resilience hubs are typically not places that move. They're an existing community space that is usually well trusted and well utilized. And they're augmented to support residents in their everyday needs, but also with coordinating communication, thinking about distribution of resources, and increasing our relationships with each other, because human adaptive capacity is really built on strong relationships and strong connectivity. And so looking at an existing trusted location is a critical component of this. Then also looking at different elements of the hub itself. This allows us to work at the sort of nexus of resilience and emergency management and mitigation and social equity. So we have our 5 different areas that we think of with a resilience hub. And when you saw the first slide, the reason there was a snowflake on there is I say resilience hubs are like snowflakes. There are no 2 that are alike. This is guidance based on just working on resilience hubs for a very long time of the 5 main areas that we think are the foundations of a resilience hub. And that's resilience services and programming. One of the key things that I think happens a lot with a resilience hub is that folks think, oh, let's put a resilient power system on a building and that makes it a hub. And I think the pandemic has really shown us that a power system is not the way to have community resilience. We really need to focus outside of just the power systems and more on the community needs, more on the services and programming, more on that proactive component. So the services and programming is a critical piece of this, and something that I know is easier to ignore, but I really want to make sure that you don't. I would say this should be the foundation of any hub. And that's really looking at identifying with community members what are their needs, what are the things they need the site to have, and what are the different services and programming they need in all 3 modes. In communications, it's doing a lot of the proactive communications. Like I said, a lot of that reaching out to folks, getting to know them well, communicating, building up that trust. But then also in the event of a disruption, having folks understand how to have both internal and external communication and have access to good information. The building itself and the landscape around it are critical components. So strengthening the facility itself and looking at also opportunities to use the surrounding landscape. And I listed some examples on the bottom here of what we've integrated into other sites, but this is not the end all be all. The resilient power system, again, an important component, but really not the thing to center around. Power system is critical, but it is not the foundation of a resilience hub. And then the operations, ensuring that we have people who understand what their roles are and that they're able to have that leadership, and that we have accessibility for the site, that we have assigned task management and different roles in the modes. So these are our 5 foundational components. And the way that we've really been able to bring these to light is through Resilience Hub workshops, where we break down what a hub or a certain location looks like, and do so with our 5 main resilience areas. And then we have these sort of sub areas that are identified with members of the community. So if you look on the left under sort of services and programming, we have things related to health and wellness, medical, food services, child and pet care, potable water. Those are just some of the examples. And what we do is we have all 3 modes identified in all of those 5 areas, and go through and have members of the community identify what is the base thing, what is the absolute base that we need in order for this to be a functioning resilience hub, what would be more ideal for everyone? What would we like to see there? And then if we had all the money in the world, what would be our sort of optimal or best situation? I think I might have said those backwards, but optional and then ideal. So ideal being if we could meet living building challenge and everybody had a job and everybody had everything they needed from that site. So sort of setting your goals in this way with the community, but doing so in our different function spaces and also within our different content areas. And what USDN has done is I've been working on resilience hubs for a long time now. And in that, wanting to make sure that we share all of this information with everyone so that we can have the actual steps to action, less planning, less sitting in rooms, and more getting it done. That's a lot of what we're hoping for with this work. And so we have a website that outlines everything about resilience hubs, what they are, why we need them, how they work. And they break down all the different elements around corrective action, around racial equity, around how we need to be thinking about all of those components as the foundation of resilience hubs. So if you're looking for more information, the website is on the bottom of the slide. It's at resilience-hub.org. Another resource is we recognize that pre-pandemic, we weren't thinking about situations where people weren't gathering in spaces. However, it did take time to say that actual resilience hubs would be critical and really, really great to have in the event of a pandemic. They can help us with community-based testing locations and having them in that trusted location, thinking about distribution centers, the fact that often we have deliveries that go and sit in parking lots in places that people don't even know they're there. And so that we have an established distribution center for any sort of disruption. That we have locations potentially to help with coordinating child care, especially for those who are first responders, and also meals as schools are closed. And then also looking at sort of the organizing of different virtual platforms, making sure folks are differently connected and thinking about this redundancy that we need. So I also put the link to that article. It's at Reuters and it was published on March 27th, 2020. But just a way to think about the fact that hubs, you don't need to bring everybody to one space in order for them to be effective. They actually can be effective in so many different ways. We also have a lot of resources on the website. We developed 2 resources very early in development of resilience hubs. So those are on the left-hand side of this slide. One is this introduction to resilience hubs and just sort of a very brief intro. I think we're actually going to be updating this document this year because it's a little outdated at this point. And then we worked with one of our partners to do a much more in-depth look at powering community resilience and thinking about our hybrid solutions for solar and storage. So both of those documents are online and available. We also, though, on the right side, recently in the last year completed a guidance document to developing Resilience Hub. And this is a step-by-step guidance document for how to put together your team, who should be involved, what does the area look like, what is the building, components to consider. And there's an analysis tool, and I say that with quotation marks because the tool itself is actually just a spreadsheet because we wanted to make it as easy as possible for people to go in and change it for themselves and for the unique characteristics of their site, but they go hand in hand. So this guidance document is quite large, but it gives you all the guidance on how to develop a hub, and the tool, which is that Excel document, has more of the assessments, the security assessment, the kitchen assessment, certain things related to services and specs and program goals that you can go in and change on your own. We also have some documentation on making the case. I understand that it's sometimes really difficult to get folks to invest in something that they've never seen before and they haven't seen work. I can't tell you the number of times that people ask me for case studies on resilience hubs. Again, this is when I come back to the snowflake and say, these are like snowflakes. I'm not going to tell you something that worked in New York City is going to work in LA County. It's not the same. It's not the same sort of characteristics. It's not the same sort of setup. It's even not the same sort of communities in a lot of ways. And so really getting out of the idea of case studies here, we're providing more progress reports on certain sites that are in progress, but we have put together some documentation that makes the case for why we want to invest in hubs and why we need to be thinking about the legacy of our discriminatory policies and practices as part of a corrective action through this approach. So I'm not going to read this to you, but a lot of this information is available online, and it does help to make that return on investment argument with your chief financial officers or other folks that you might be working with on financing, thinking about the fact that we're actually saving on 311 calls, 911 calls, that we're actually increasing this community cohesion, that we're thinking a lot about job training and opportunities for folks as part of this work. And I've mentioned a few times that this is about corrective action. It's actually around power shifting. So we're actually looking to get government and other organizations and institutions to willingly shift power to the members of the community and to the community-based organizations. That means we typically recommend that these sites are not government-owned and managed. We recommend that these are sites that are usually owned by a community-based organization, or that you have a memorandum of understanding that allows members of the community or certain folks who have gone through training to be able to access and open the site. The reason for that is often in a big disruption, if somebody doesn't live in the community, they're not going to be there to open and activate the site. Also, we want members of the community to be the ones who are actually running it and managing it. So there's a huge element around power shifting here. And just to note that we base the entire hub on shifting of power to members of the community. There are a lot of opportunities. This could be 7 different slides for ways to use resilience hubs. These are just a few things that we've seen in other locations, certainly resources and information. I've mentioned tool checkouts and tool sharing, a lot of youth leadership and youth engagement, thinking a lot about food, water, and air quality and access to all of them, training on different tools, and then doing a lot of gathering of information that folks need and want to use. So again, this can be a lot more, but I just wanted to give a few ideas of the way hubs can be utilized. We also have some partners. So I am based out of Baltimore. I work a lot with our communities on the East Coast, but it's really hard to know everything about every single specific community in the US and Canada. So what's wonderful is that USDN has been actively working on partnerships with folks in different parts of the country. And we are really lucky in Southern California to have partnered with Climate Resolve to help activate through our supporting tools and our support network, the implementation of resilience hubs in that area. And so I'm really grateful that you're going to listen to Natalie next and that group. And I'm happy to answer questions later on. But that is my brief presentation. I'm not sure, Erin, how do I give you control back here?
Great.
I'm going to try sharing my screen. Hi, this is Natalie Hernandez. Have you seen my screen?
We see your Google. Now it's loading up.
Okay.
Yeah. Yep.
Let me go back. Hi, everyone. My name is Natalie Hernandez. I'm the Associate Director of Climate Planning and Resilience for Climate Resolve. And I'll give an overview of what's happening with resilience hubs in the Los Angeles region with a case study of what's been happening with the city of Los Angeles. First, I want to also acknowledge the experiences I bring with me into this presentation. I think Baja did a great reminder of doing that. And I want to let folks know I am a Latina from Mexican American descent. I'm tuning in from my house in Long Beach, which is on Tongva ancestral land. And if you don't know about Climate Resolve, I'll give you also a brief intro into our nonprofit organization. We're based in LA and we work on local solutions to climate change because we know that the best way to encourage climate action is to make it local and relatable and to focus on the solutions. To us, climate action isn't a nasty medicine that one needs to take, but rather we can improve the quality of life and make our world a more just one. We do some policy advocacy work like increase investments in neighborhoods that make it better for walking, biking, and taking public transit. We also provide technical assistance to help cities and schools develop projects and apply for funds such as stormwater management and cool roofs. And we do some pilot projects ourselves to show how to make a difference. One of the things that's been happening in the city of LA since 2014 is resilience hubs initiatives and also policy actions. So between 2014 and 2018, there were a couple efforts going on to create resilience hubs in South Los Angeles, particularly led by SCOPE and USGBC LA. There was a desire to convert 2 churches in South Los Angeles into resilience hub spaces as a part of a green block initiative on Florence Avenue. It was envisioned to be a centralized hub for residents, job seekers, students, and small business owners to collaborate on workforce development, clean energy technologies, and neighborhood resilience strategies. The project unfortunately didn't come to full fruition because of multiple factors, including difficulty permitting, but left impacts of community building capacity and a physical green roof atop one of the churches. In 2018, the City of LA published the Resilient LA Plan, which included a section on providing support for the resilience hubs. The city committed to providing tools and networks to encourage the creation of more resilience hubs by streamlining regulatory and policy processes, and by connecting organizations with partners that can provide guidance, technical assistance, and financial capacity. So the city's doing a number of things. They're going to create a hub planning toolkit, creating an online resilience resource hub, also establishing a neighborhood resilience hubs advisory group, supporting the neighborhood resilience hub pilots, and then compiling available public and private sources. The Resilience LA Plan also stated that hubs should support critical community needs such as community organizing, workforce development, education, public health and well-being, environmental protection, sustainability, civic engagement, and social justice. And just to say, you know, Baja mentioned that no hub is like another, and I think there's just an array of services that a hub could provide. So the case study that I'm going to talk about right now is in progress. It's in Boyle Heights and is led in part by Erin Coutts, who's also participating in this webinar. And he's the City of Los Angeles Chief Resilience Officer. And then the Boyle Heights Arts Conservancy is the Resilience Hub partner. They're a nonprofit organization dedicated to creating inclusive pathways to career in film, television, broadcasting, and digital content creation. If you're not familiar with Boyle Heights, here's some demographic information. The neighborhood is just on the outskirts of downtown, east of the 5 freeway, and east of the Arts District. Historically, it's home to a Mexican-American population and a former Jewish population. It's one of the most dense neighborhoods in Los Angeles. Generally, the population has a lower medium household income and educational attainment levels than the rest of the city. Unfortunately, Boyle Heights has also faced increased pressures of gentrification over the past decade, pricing out some of its current residents. Side note, if you're interested in watching a dramification of what's going on in Boyle Heights, there's a Netflix show called Gentrification. As mentioned, the Boyle Heights Resilience Hubs is currently in progress. It's offering services and programming such as career training, a community meeting place, youth education, community history, a makeshift emergency shelter, and then it serves as a large event venue, has a radio station, and a pizzeria is supposed to open up soon. The space is meeting 3 of the 5 USDN Resilience Hub framing categories, including programming, structure and landscaping, and communications. And the hub is still working on getting their own power source and systems for ongoing operations. Here's a list of the partners helping with the hub. Aside from Boyle Heights Conservatory, there is support from City of LA offices, American Red Cross, USGBN, and USGBC. So with the American Red Cross, their role in this Resilience Hub process is really to provide emergency preparedness training. There's a list of all the different things that they do, from CPR to youth preparedness and sound the alarm with free smoke alarm installation. And I think what's neat is they are both trying to provide the emergency preparedness training in English and in Spanish. USDN assists with many different things, including guidance, the nationwide network of Resilience Hub contacts, and then access to funding and technical partners. USGBC LA are experts in building performance, and they provide assistance on energy and water systems, as well as other materials and infrastructure. Then with LADWP, they're our utility manager, and they have the ability to provide rebates, audits, microgrids, EV infrastructure. And LADWP also has access to the clean energy partners at the LA Clean Tech Incubator, LaCretz Innovation Campus in the Arts District. So the next step for City of LA Resilience Hubs, right now the city and USDN are working on pulling funds together to implement a feasibility study for a power system on the Boyle Heights Resilience Hub space. Climate Resolve is also trying to secure funding from the California state budget for resilience hubs. And then we're working with community-based organizations around the city of LA on the topic of land use and resilience for the community plans. And we're hoping resilience hubs come out to be one of the strategies that residents and policy officials would like to support. And I want to end this presentation by saying Climate Resolve has been supporting the work in Boyle Heights. It's really led by the community there and Erin Coutts. And then we're working closely with USDN and others to spur or activate other resilience hubs in the Los Angeles region. By nature, all the resilience hubs are bespoke, and they need to be uniquely suited to the needs of the communities that they serve. So we want to help coordinate, provide technical assistance with our energy and water staff, and we have access to advocacy channels, data resources, funding, and a network of partners. So with that, here's my contact information. There's also another staff member, Chase, who's working really closely on resilience hubs, and you're welcome to email us with any questions.
Great. All right, so yes, my name is Eric Fournier. I'm the research director at the California Center for Sustainable Communities at UCLA. I think this is a fantastic event, and I thank Erin and the LARC for putting it on and inviting me to speak. So what I'm going to be talking about is some work that we've been doing in terms of developing a tool for solar prioritization in Los Angeles County, and how some of the interest in the development of that tool has sort of started to steer towards resiliency services that community scale solar sites can provide. And so as background for this, the development of this tool is kind of proceeded in two phases. So in the first phase, we prototyped a version of this under a grant from the California Energy Commission. And then more recently, over the last year and a half or so, we've been developing a version 2.0 of the tool under a grant from the Strategic Growth Council. But I don't have a ton of time, but at a high level, this is sort of an overview of our process. So our group at UCLA maintains a repository of account level energy demand that we've published in the form of what we call the LA Energy Atlas. And this is basically a website within the Southern California region that allows you to drill down to sort of local geographic areas and understand the composition of energy use as associated with building attributes. So with this data, we started thinking about potential integrations to understand the relationship of how much energy is being demanded on a particular property and how much energy could solar panels that are installed on the rooftop of that property provide. Los Angeles County is actually a very data-rich environment with respect to these types of issues. So as part of a program called the LARC program, which is the Los Angeles Regional Imagery Acquisition Consortium, long mouthful, estimates for the rooftop solar potential of every single building in Los Angeles County above 400 square feet have been generated. And so that provides a really interesting opportunity. Now you have sort of supply and you have demand, and you can think about the relationships between those things at a building level. Another component of this that we're able to look at is the capacity of grid infrastructure throughout the region. And this is actually one of the less obvious constraints to the development of rooftop solar projects, is that most of the time you want to think about you'd like to get the benefits of connecting a rooftop solar system that you install at a particular location to the local electric power grid, either so that you can engage in net metering and get paid for excess energy that you might sell back to the grid, or if you have a storage project, you know, do that similar type of arbitrage. So within Southern California, we actually have in the investor-owned utility service territory for Southern California Edison, we have data on the infrastructure capacity of different grid circuits. And so those capacities, there are actual rules that determine the amount of solar that you can connect to the grid at a particular location is determined by the capacity of the grid infrastructure there. So we wanted to take that into consideration as well, because that could be sort of a fatal flaw in the planning of a large or intermediate scale project, is if the local circuit doesn't have enough capacity, you might be prevented from connecting to the grid without making some investments in terms of upgrading that grid infrastructure. And then finally, we're interested in incorporating CalEnviroScreen data to think about the social justice and equity issues associated with both the opportunities for these types of projects and things like the distribution of grid infrastructure capacity. So this is kind of all fairly abstract. I was hoping to make this a bit more concrete by just showing you a sort of county level overview of some of these data sets, and it might illustrate the issue a little bit better. So when I say we have the building footprints for every building in Los Angeles County, I really mean that. I mean, we have something like 2.4 million building outlines to a very high level of detail. And using other data sources like LiDAR imagery that's captured from planes and models of solar insolation, you can go through this process where you can generate an estimate of the rooftop potential of solar panels installed on the maximum amount of suitable area on each one of those buildings. This is sort of a complex overview, but there's a pipeline that can be done in an automatic way, and so you get a number for each one of those building footprints. And so when you look at each one of those buildings, you have a very sort of broad but also detailed view of the rooftop solar potential opportunities for individual properties, individual buildings. And so then from Southern California Edison, we're able to get data on where is the grid infrastructure. So where are all the poles and the wires throughout this territory. And it turns out that those pieces of grid infrastructure are organized into these units called circuits. And so each circuit, which serves a local area and set of buildings, has its own capacity number. And so when you're thinking about, as I said, installing a large-scale grid-connected solar system on a facility, you have to think about what's the capacity on the local circuit. And then finally, thinking about where these opportunities exist, where you have sufficient grid capacity, you have sufficient rooftop area, with respect to the location of disadvantaged communities, which is the technical designation within the CalEnviroScreen program, where the percentile score of a census tract is above 75% statewide. And so this is sort of the layout of those communities in Los Angeles County shown here in red. So right now, that's sort of describing a lot of the work that went into the development of the version 1 prototype tool. Right now, we're working on version 2, and so we're not yet at the stage where we have a functioning version of the phase 2 tool that I can show you, but I'll just describe what we're doing now. So we've been working with a group of CBO partners that work throughout Los Angeles County to try to alter the design of our prototype tool so that we can better suit their needs in terms of understanding local opportunities for the development of rooftop solar systems. And as part of this, we realized it's really important to also try to help educate these CBO partners about how the energy system works, both technically and institutionally. It's incredibly complex. The grid is the largest and most complicated piece of machinery that man has ever created, and it turns out a lot of the institutional and administrative organs that have evolved to maintain the operations of the grid and the delivery of power are similarly complex. So we've been engaging in a series of these workshops to go back and forth in terms of discussing how the system works and what types of information would be most useful to expose through a version of this tool. And so based upon some of these interactions, our strategy has sort of pivoted in terms of delivering a tool that focuses on opportunities to install solar arrays on community facilities. These could be, publicly or privately owned, as mentioned in Kristen's presentation. And our core idea was that these facilities could function as the anchor for pilot virtual net metering programs. And so a virtual net metering program is an idea where basically it's a recognized problem that people who are renters or live in multifamily complexes don't have the same opportunity to install solar on their roofs as somebody who's, a property owner that lives in a single family home. And therefore, they're sort of structurally prevented from receiving the benefits of these net metering rates. And so a virtual net metering program basically says, well, if I install a large solar PV system on a community facility, is it possible to allocate the excess power production of that system virtually to one or more residents of a multifamily or renter household that can't have their own solar on their own roof? And so that was very interesting to the CBOs. They really liked that idea because it creates an opportunity for more people in their communities to receive benefits from these types of systems. But they were also interested in the potential resiliency benefits as well. So we've been thinking about what might be the opportunity to co-locate energy storage and what types of resilience needs exist in these communities from an energy standpoint. So for me, this is actually a great learning opportunity. I really enjoyed the previous presentations describing what some of those needs are and the differentiation of them. So yeah, that's a sort of a summary of our work, and happy to continue the conversation and learn from you all as well.
Fantastic.
So a first question from the audience: when will the tool Eric described be live, and what are the possibilities of it being adapted for other areas in Northern California?
Yeah, that's a good question. So our schedule on the SGC project has been pushed. I'm assuming as a lot of schedules have been on similar types of projects that involve outreach with community-based organizations. So we're extending, I think the final delivery of the tool will be either in the second or third quarter of 2021, I think the second quarter. The challenge with creating a similar type of tool like this in other areas is it's the sort of uniqueness of the data sources that are required. So the UCLA Energy Atlas has consumption data for Southern California Edison right now. We're working on developing a new energy atlas for the something called the Bay Area Renewable Energy Network, which is a group of 9 counties in PG&E territory, but it's not the full PG&E territory. Getting access to account level consumption data from energy utilities in California is difficult, to put it mildly. And then on top of that, you also need these other resources in terms of the building rooftop solar capacity and the grid distribution circuits. PG&E does have those circuits available because it's required by the state, the CPUC, but yeah, it's just a tricky process. We're hoping that by developing this tool for Southern California and demonstrating its usefulness for planning these types of projects, it'll motivate the powers that be to sort of open up some of these data sources that are needed to do it elsewhere.
Thank you. And a couple more questions on your project. What's the best way to stay updated on your project's progress, Eric?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll have to talk to our project manager, but I can, if whoever's interested can give me their email. I'm sure we're going to be developing a distribution list to notify interested parties when it goes live and what the status of it is at different points. So yeah, please just send me your email and
great.
Make sure that
and Eric, if you want to try and chime in on the chat as well, someone was asking about good sources of guidance or resources for virtual net metering programs. I'm going to take a question from the audience who had their hand raised. Corey Bytoff.
Hi, thanks very much. This is for Natalie and Baja. Thank you very much for your presentations. we are looking at a community center in San Rafael that would be a good location for a resilience hub. And I really appreciate the idea of the complexities of shifting power and not recommending a government-owned facility. But this is by far the best place for a resilience hub. And there's really not many other opportunities in the neighborhood. And so I'm wondering if you have any, like, if you could go in a little bit more detail about, what are some of the pros and cons, or what are some of the things to watch out for if it was to be determined by the community that that is the best place for a resilience hub and it's government owned.
Natalie, if you want, I can start, and then if you have any other additional thoughts. So if it's a government-owned building, we recommend having a memorandum of understanding of who opens that location, when it's open, and having some sort of guidance from the community on what are the services and programming they would like from that site. Does it have those existing services and programming? Is it set up to give them what their needs are? A lot of our government buildings are not structured in ways to meet a wide range of needs. They're there for a specific reason. So it's more of a partnership, more of a being very honest and transparent with the community about this site won't be able to do these things. It can potentially do these things. And these are some of the things in the middle that we're gonna have to figure out over time. So I think there's a big element around transparency with those. Certainly having an MOU about who runs the site. Are there community members that are going to have the ability to do that, or community partners, especially in the event of a disruption? If somebody doesn't live within that neighborhood, it becomes a really complex issue because then they can't get to the location. So in the event of a big earthquake, for us, it's often big snow events. Those sites are really difficult to get to. And so we always try to make sure that there are at least 3 to 5 members of the community that live within the certain area around the site to be able to activate it. The other things I would say outside of just the building is, are there surrounding spaces landscape-wise that the city or county is willing to give up to the community to retrofit for some of the additional needs potentially around urban ag or other stuff like that. So I think giving as much as possible, being as transparent as possible, and then also having some of those MOUs are very helpful.
The only thing I'll add is a lot of time when I work with communities, there is a lack of trust between government and the communities. And so as much as you're doing for relationship building before that process and before really determining that that's the site that folks want to use, I think is the best way to go about it, establishing that trust. And I like what Baja says about creating that MOU and making sure someone has the keys to open that space if they really need to. So that's all I'll add.
Thanks. And we also had a question from the audience about different funding mechanisms. Besides grants, what have been some of the funding mechanisms for successful resilience hubs? How do you raise funding?
Yeah, I actually have a slide that's a bunch of puzzle pieces that don't go together for this one. And that's because right now we don't have one source of funding. We've been having a hard time, especially with this federal administration, of getting the desire to move forward on funding these proactively. We're hoping that that changes with an administration change. State governments are typically asking for having pilot sites that they can look at to determine whether or not they're worth funding. Certain states we've had some interest, but it's mostly from the energy side. And so it's really hard because we're piecemealing together different sources of funding. Philanthropy has played a big role in the services and programming funding and in the communications funding, and certainly with helping with some of the smaller retrofits, especially things that are distributed to members of the community, food, water, other things like that. External partner organizations. So we've been doing some partnerships with like food banks and as Natalie mentioned, Red Cross for some of the training. It depends on the area, which organizations can provide certain elements related to one of the 5 resilience areas. We do have some partnerships with folks who have been repurposing philanthropic dollars, again, mostly for the energy sources. And then some of the city governments have actually been able to bring in some resources either through resilience funding or sustainability funding. We're trying one test right now with Honolulu to do a CDBG DR using funding for a resilience hub and a retrofit to a site. So a lot of these are in progress, but again, there's no one size fits all.
Thanks. And in a related question, oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to chime in and see if our grants and proposal manager wanted to say anything. Woodrow, are you there? Okay, maybe. Yes. Oh, you are? Okay. Woodrow, I just wanted to know if you had anything you wanted to add about like funding sources that we're going after as Climate Resolve for resilience hubs.
Resilience hubs are kind of involved in several of our projects. We are not seeking funding specifically for a resilience hub, but I know that they're involved in several of our projects. And there are some kind of emerging resources on the government end and also on the foundation side as well. It seems like some of the larger foundations are starting to come around this idea. But yeah, there's stuff out there, but it's kind of still developing, I think.
Thanks, Woodrow.
Thanks. So on a related note, someone was asking about whether we have any examples of local governments. You know, local governments tend to be very siloed, units really focused on specific topics. Any good examples of local governments sort of unraveling themselves to be more flexible and organic and be able to address the breadth of community needs and concerns?
Yeah, we have a couple good examples of local governments around the country that have come together around the hubs concept and brought together a lot of other partners, a lot of different parts of government to identify ways of utilizing resources and opportunities. I would say that Washington, D.C. with Ward 7 has done a lot of work through an equity advisory committee over the last 2 years. They've been really focused on the community leadership and community process. So actually training community based org and other community leaders to lead the meetings, do the agenda setting, doing a lot of the outreach, and government kind of sat off to the side. And now they're going through the process of identifying which sites people trust most and want to utilize. But that's been really run by DOEE, and they've brought in partners from all different parts of the district. City of Minneapolis has done a really great job of bringing together a lot of different initiatives. So they brought together their comprehensive planning unit, their planning department, their sustainability office, their energy office, and the folks who are working on sort of their green corridors program and aligning a resilience hub with their green corridors to make sure that there were other multi-benefits. And so they've been working with a partner organization called Little Earth Tribes to develop a resilience hub in Minneapolis and sort of building off of that. And then Rhode Island actually has done a really amazing job of stepping back. They were developing a climate resilience or climate action plan, and they took a step back, said this actually needs to be run by the community, and it's now become their racial justice plan or their equity plan that's driving forward some of the initiatives, and resilience hubs is one of those.
Excellent, thank you. Another question we had comes through via the chat, and we've only got about 2 minutes left, just as a warning to everybody. Someone was asking about kind of the role of hubs during this pandemic period and how resilience hubs can function without relying on physical space. Could you add a bit more to that topic?
I can add some, and I was going to see if Erin wanted to unmute himself to also chime in, but I know that he's been contacting the folks at the Boyle Heights Conservancy, and they said that during COVID, they've actually reopened, it was closed, but they reopened the space to respond to the requests of some of the youth who this was taking like an emotional and mental toll on. So I guess, you know, with following CDC guidelines, they were still able to like hold that space and like provide a way for folks to kind of reflect on the BLM protests and still have some sort of like community building aspect to it. Erin, please write it to the chat if you want to add anything else.
Yeah, or you can unmute yourself, Erin, if you want to chime in.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can.
Hello, can you hear me? Okay. You know, I was actually one comment I wanted to make that was more about picking sites as opposed to answering the question I want to answer as opposed to the one that was asked of me. Is really about picking sites. One thing that I would suggest that seems to be helpful is finding, if you're looking for a site, is to find a site that's already serving that you could almost already tag as a resilience hub. And we're working with this organization that was mentioned, the Boyle Heights Arts Conservatory, because they, I would argue that they're already serving as a resilience hub, even though they're not tagged as one. So that's something that might be helpful when thinking about where a resilience hub might be. As far as the social distancing question, it is really hard. I mean, I can't say that the board, other than the example that Natalie gave, and kind of reopening doors, and that's really, I mean, they did it with social distancing, but I can say that some of the things the city has done is we're looking at digitization of services and of projects. I mean, not only our zoo and our libraries have done a lot more online. And so that's definitely something that hubs can look at, is not only what you can provide physically, but then with the technology that exists today, what of these services can be provided electronically or over the phone. And now that we see that this crisis we're dealing with is something that is a different dynamic, right? Where we're not trying to gather people together, that it's creating new lines of thought of how hubs might be able to work and provide services. And so finding ways to provide those services, from afar is for sure part of the discussion at this point.
Thank you so much. And I know we need to go to break before the breakouts, but Erin, did you want to formally introduce yourself as well? I'm sure a lot of folks on the call know you, but it'd be helpful, I think, to just have a quick introduction to your role in the city of LA. He might be back on mute already. Well, Erin is the Chief Resilience Officer for City of LA, so thank you for sharing that. I believe we now have a 5-minute break. Erin, is that correct, before going into breakout sessions?
That's it. Exactly.
In the group to share, or I can share quickly what we got from the group. All right. So we had a good conversation about a couple specific areas. City of Watsonville, looking at the community there, thinking about a current nature center and some of the community partners they already have working on climate change, but trying to bring together and collaborate a little bit more strongly with that group. Having government folks realize that what they want is maybe not always aligned with what the community wants, so reshaping and going into that conversation differently. We had some folks who have been working in New Orleans and Atlanta who have some building space that could become a true resilience hub. It's grounded right now a little bit in disaster resilience and risk resilience, so potentially expanding that and thinking more about food security, different dialogues with neighborhoods and internet access. We had City of San Rafael also talking about a community center that already feels a lot like a hub, a very trusted location with a lot of ESL classes, a library, a gym, outdoor fields. So there are certain things that are missing and certain things that they can bring as government, but identifying that there are certain other partners that they would need to bring in. And some good news is that Drawdown Marin just approved resilience hubs as a component. So now the county is involved, which brings potentially some funding. We also had a gentleman who recently moved to Glendale who has some very good experience working on the quantitative argument and private equity, acknowledging that government is broken and moves really slowly. And so is there an opportunity to utilize his expertise, because resilience in his words is the word of the year, to bring in some better funding to move resilience hubs forward faster with some of that private funding. We also had some good comments just around working with cities and campuses and folks who are knowledge banks who can bring more information in from international sources.
Excellent, thank you. All right, Natalie's group, do you want to report on?
Yeah, and I'll just go ahead because I was taking some notes. So we had a great group of folks from Metro, City of Santa Monica, an attorney working on community wealth, someone from the state, well, who works with the state water board, but not directly them. And we talked about everything from wanting a cooling center to also just ensuring that there's connectivity to the Resilience Center, like via Metro bus service routes. We also had someone from the Baldwin Hills Conservancy, sorry, I'm jumping around, and talking about utilizing the parklands to be more accessible during disasters, for example, and like a place where people could go for COVID testing, or having a place where folks can connect with a public health officer, or even applying to home services. So thinking about centers that are near parks, I think, is something that hasn't been brought up yet that I thought was interesting. And then, there is the City of Santa Monica who's looking at a government facility, particularly a library, and what the services they already provide with their programming and the multi-service rooms, but also being aware of the limitations that could bring, especially if the city is financially constrained at this moment in time. So that was just some of what we got to talk about. And I really enjoyed the conversation, which is why I was asking if we could share the emails.
Excellent, thank you. Eric's group.
Yeah, I think we had a pretty good conversation. We started with some high-level discussion of sort of the differences between centralized versus decentralized solutions to providing energy resilience. The hub kind of evokes this idea of a place, but you could also imagine distributing decentralized equipment to folks to provide a similar type of effect, particularly in the era of COVID. We also discussed, I guess, the importance of having social infrastructure. Like there has to exist a community-based organization or some other social institution that has the capacity to support the creation and programming of a Resilience Hub. And, the existence of that infrastructure may not perfectly align with the need for resilience support. We also talked about, how making modifications to buildings or installing new energy equipment or resilience-based equipment can be expensive, and those types of things need to pay for themselves, not only in times of crisis. So sort of stacking the value streams associated with anything that you do in the world. We had a gentleman from the CPUC that talked about the existence of these rebate programs that's provided by the CPUC for installing energy storage systems to deliver backup power for essential utilities like water pumps and things like that. And so that was an interesting program. And then we also had a representative from a CVO that provides, an NGO that provides technical support to people for doing carbon emissions accounting. And around that sort of mission, we were thinking about how they could align what their organization is doing with efforts to promote awareness of resiliency needs and sort of the creation of resiliency hubs in different areas.
Excellent. All right. Chase's group.
Cool. Yeah, I also took a little bit of notes as well, so I'll go ahead. But yeah, we had a really great discussion. There's a really diverse and awesome group of folks, and I think everyone's kind of recognizing how they work within resilience, whether they were realizing it before or not. So we heard from someone in Santa Barbara who is talking about how there's a pretty diverse, even just topographical landscape there, and having a big county, you have needs around food security or heat. And then there's also language access, which during the wildfire season was increasingly a huge issue. And then in NorCal, we were talking about how sustainability offices and other regional agencies have worked in the past with cooling centers and other sort of resilient solutions, but Resilience Hub as an ideological framework can also help people kind of see like, okay, well, in this space, yes, it's functioning as a cooling center, but also it's a space where people come to get information and meet each other. So there's resilient possibilities in these spaces that don't have to be within the scope of maybe what the space was originally called. And then in Los Angeles, we were talking a little bit about how there's a lot of sort of synergies happening around resilience where as food security becomes a huge need, food rescue organizations can then link in with, for example, a lot of homeless services agencies. And there's a lot of folks that are sort of active in the community, chambers of commerce and otherwise, that are sort of coming into the fold that weren't before. So kind of building those networks, understanding and recognizing that new energy. And then we talked a little bit about a park in Santa Monica that really functioned as a resilient space. And I really liked that example because like Baja talks about centering people rather than the disaster. It was a space where people came together and recognized as really important to the community beforehand, where a lot of programming was brought in before any kind of disruption, and then sort of honoring that in a disruption. And bringing in programming around food security. And we talked about kind of the potential for, if you are a regional government, kind of recognizing those spaces that you do have as assets and really empowering the community that has stepped up there. So a lot of diversity, a lot of really great stuff.
All right, thank you. And for my group, I've got Kristen was going to do the report out and took some notes for us. Thank you.
Yeah, we had a lot of good discussion. We talked first a little bit about hubs functioning as something that's tied to the changing environment. So whether that means, you know, addressing wildfires or sea level rise hazards or acting as cooling centers. But also there was a big discussion about hubs as communication center. So not only communication in the event of something catastrophic happening, you know, providing information to the community about resources, but also just general community outreach about, you know, how the hub is integrated into the, you know, the function of the community as a way to network between hubs and provide a more robust like social network structure. We also, Felicia from the UCLA Center for Sustainable Communities was talking about something she had heard with the center being able to, the hub being able to model and provide examples for different types of energy transitions that people might want to make in their homes to help familiarize community members with that, with the sort of intricacies of that. We also talked about the LA mayor has directives of resiliency and sustainability, and those are often disjointed efforts. And so combining those and seeing how they overlapped and connect could be a function of the hub itself. Melody from the USCC grant talked about how her org could work on the translation of science and helping any research needs that are identified by local communities. And yeah, there was some other good stuff. Also as hubs acting as cultural centers and providing functions like youth programming and you know, community gardens and being a central, really community center in that way.
Thank you. So a lot of really great stuff from the breakout groups. We want to move on to kind of next steps and some concrete things that folks can do. But before we do, does anyone have any general comments or takeaways that they wanted to share with the group for just a couple minutes here?
I'm just going to mention one thing about, it got brought up a number of times, the cooling centers. And if folks do look at data and also if you've ever been to a cooling center yourself, they're often just like hurricane shelters and other sort of spaces. They're shelters that don't feel accommodating, usually very helpful. You know, some of them are libraries and existing sites, but to just have like a big open space for cooling, often they're not utilized very well. So one of the things to remember is that we want to treat people like humans, and human spaces often have a bit more to them than the 4 blank walls and a couple of chairs. So in just remembering that a lot of times our cooling centers are not very welcoming spaces, and to consider that if you're retrofitting an existing cooling center.
Yeah, I might say on top of that, we've heard anecdotally in some of our work that, you know, a movie theater is used often as a cooling center for those reasons.
I also think it's important to continually be discussing with the community what is and what isn't working. I think maybe a lot of times people who do this work routinely maybe settle into an idea of what does and doesn't work, and either whether it's through surveys or through community forums or whatever is accessible to the community, keeping it accessible and understanding that people's needs change and that accessibility needs might change, and keeping that in mind.
Thanks. Any other general comments? I saw some nice feedback in the chat, so thanks all. I think it has been a great dialogue, a lot of really great presentations. I'm kind of loving generally the breakout stuff in Zoom, because that's obviously something that's always really good, and in-person meetings is the small group discussion, so I'm glad they have that feature. Well, we were hoping that we'd go beyond just sort of the moderated discussion today and really think about what we can do next moving forward. So in this next part, we're going to ask if if there are any organizations that would have like a concrete step they know they could take, or that they would like to at least explore taking in the establishment of a resilience hub. Anyone want to commit to anything today, or propose something that they might want to take back to their organization to explore?
This is Walker with Ramey Associates. I think part of the first step is just to bring the idea into the room. So, in our work on climate action plans, this is a thing that we bring up. So we don't, most climate action plans have 2 A's in them now. There's the action, it's a cap with 2 A's, and, action and adaptation. And so, often people look at, what could flood, what could catch on fire. But somebody needs to say, hey, you have all of these assets. You have community centers, senior centers, rec centers. Those could do something else concurrently, which could be, a resilient hub. Let's look at maybe where there's a community of need and where there could be a fit between these different things we've talked about: a facility, a need, some of the civic infrastructure, community-based organization, and at least kind of put the idea on the table so it can be considered. And this, to be honest, is what happened with the resilience plan for the city of LA. At some point, somebody had to say, hey, we should include resilience hubs in this plan. And then it's in there. It's an idea that's taken hold. We continue to talk about it. So that's something that we're, can continue to do, are doing, but can continue to do, is to just introduce the idea into the conversation.
Well,
thanks.
This is Eric Fournier from UCLA. One of the things that I would be interested in seeing, and we've been working to try to develop, but is sort of a list of the types of sites that should be considered as eligible as candidates for establishment of resilience hubs, right? So for me, participating in this call, there are obvious merits. There's pros and cons associated with the choice of publicly owned facilities, and the idea of expanding the scope to include privately owned facilities. I would be interested in getting a sense of what types of privately owned facilities should be under consideration, right? Because what we've been thinking about to this point are sort of, recreation centers, schools, parks, et cetera, and I'm just wondering how wide we should cast that net in terms of our own work, the search for eligible sites.
Yeah, I think this well-loved and well-used is a great characterization. So, I've been to hundreds of hours of youth basketball games at the YMCA in Santa Monica. So that's arguably a private nonprofit organization, but you know, hundreds of thousands of people have been through there over the years. And if that was a resilience hub, I don't think anybody would have any qualms going into it, you know, being that it's, you know, a Christian organization. I don't think it would be a barrier. So I think it's some of those facilities that maybe have a religious affiliation or something else, but nonetheless function as a real hub in the community.
Yeah, absolutely. Great example. Sharon has a hand up.
Yeah, I'm Sharon from the Community Environmental Council in Santa Barbara, and we're working with a group, actually our first meeting's tomorrow, and we're looking at an area that has a number of assets, you know, parks, a strong cultural arts organization, El Centro Casa de la Raza, so they have community meeting centers, a school, there's some libraries, there's a community garden. So there's an old African-American church, and the owner of that church is wanting to pony that up as a potential spot for a resilience center. But we're also working cross town with the Boys and Girls Club. So I think the Boys and Girls Clubs are natural synergy for this, because many of them already serve that function in communities. They usually have community kitchens. They already usually have feeding centers and programs. For the kids. They usually have other types of youth serving programs. So, you know, there's some real synergy around that. So definitely I would, if I were you, consider the nonprofit organizations, because I do think that there's opportunity there for the philanthropic investment as well as that community buy-in.
Great, thank you. Jessica has her hand up.
Yeah, hi. I want to echo something from the comments and that I mentioned in the breakout groups. Is there any effort to do networking between resilience hubs?
The original
that was a great idea.
The original Los Angeles proposal was actually to do a network of hubs and to have different hubs in different communities. And Chase and Erin, I know that you guys are well aware of this, but it was determined that there wasn't enough funding without a pilot and a couple pilot sites to then go into the network approach. So the original piece in the resilience plan was an idea of a network. I know that Houston's also looking at a network. But folks haven't found the funding resources to be able to move in that approach yet. And then Erin, you asked me to talk about the schools piece. We've worked with a lot of communities who have proposed schools, and the issue with schools is that if you think about any sort of active shooter situation or any other situation where kids need to be protected, that school is not opening for anybody else in the community. It's on complete lockdown. So schools are not the best locations, because these sites are supposed to be something that's open and available to members of the surrounding area. And schools have a lot of restrictions with school boards as well. So if you've dealt with anything with MOUs and school boards, it's a nightmare. I wouldn't recommend to anyone.
Hi, this is Julie Dubrow from US Green Building Council, LA. Hi, everyone. I just wanted to alert you to, periodically check our events and our initiatives, because we have a lot of related resilience events or trainings. Heather Rosenberg is doing a series of them. One on Monday was postponed, but we'll be finishing up with a couple of hers on community. The next one is on community building, and then I believe there's going to be one on either water, or I can't remember which one is the last one. And then I just put in the chat also a resilience.la facilities guide that she actually wrote up a few years ago, prior to or in conjunction with the cities rolling out of their resilience hub plan. So and then we've got a lot of, as you were talking about, the school local resilience projects that we do on a regular basis. This year we're doing our legacy project in the West Adams Church, which is building a rooftop garden in conjunction with a group that helps train recent formerly incarcerated men. So there's a lot of stuff that's resilience based or resilience inspired to help different local communities work towards such possibilities and growing that resilience across on case-by-case basis.
Thank you so much, Julie. Anyone else want to chime in with a resource or a next step that they can commit to? Otherwise, I'll give it to Erin to close us out. And I'll just note that there are quite a few great resources. I think Erin will try to collect them from the chat, but feel free to scroll too. There's some great links that have been posted there.
Yeah, no, there's a fantastic thread going through the chat, and we will be compiling all those resources, adding them to our notes, and then distribute those. And the last thing that I just put into the chat was a survey. I know that it can be hard to commit on video in front of everyone to make commitments, but we will have a similar question in the survey. So I will drop it in here one more time to take the survey.
Erin, will the survey get sent out to the rest of the participants who weren't able to stay on this whole time?
We can do that as well. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to say thank you to LARC, Erin, and Kyle for putting this together, and the other speakers, Erin, Baja, and Nurit, because I think Climate Resolve, we're involved in this work and have been hoping to grow the role that we play. And I'm just really impressed with how many folks are really interested in this topic in the LA region and then statewide. I have contributed to a report, and I know Baja has too, that the Asian Pacific Environmental Network is coming out with. It's called Resilience Before Disaster. And there's I would say, similar effort going on in Northern California around this. And I'm glad that Southern California is also meeting the need in some ways.